They told me the signal was probably a glitch, a reflection, a trick of low-bit refraction mixed with leftover Soviet debris and the ice-blind static that plagues long-range frequencies north of the Arctic Circle. I didn't believe them not because I knew better, but because I felt better. And in this kind of work, when you've spent enough time inside unheated relay stations and listening posts built to rot in places God forgot, instinct has a sharper edge than analysis. The recording wasn't long, barely 2 minutes of fragmented audio pulled from a scrambled channel buried beneath 47 layers of white noise. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair behind my ears tighten when I played it back in my quarters on the carrier. My clearance let me dig deeper. Maybe it shouldn't have. I still remember the way the waveform shuddered when I isolated it, not like sound but like breath, like something alive inside the frequency. Not someone, something. The signal repeated one phrase in Russian over and over, distorted and slow, as if underwater. We never stopped digging. The timestamp on the metadata put it at 3:47 local time. But the strange thing is, that location didn't have a local time. There was no station, no facility, no beacon, just an old Soviet perimeter line marked as decommissioned in '92 and buried in Siberia's white void. But triangulation doesn't lie. Coordinates don't hallucinate. So when I handed in my report and asked for clarification, the answer came in the form of a sealed envelope and an immediate reassignment. They called it Echo Reconnaissance Protocol Tier 5. No briefing, no crew, just a single-man deployment to investigate potential remnants of pre-dissolution Cold War infrastructure. The coordinates matched. I knew before the orders were even read aloud. 3 days later, I was strapped into a low-altitude tactical drop shuttle. My last view of civilization was a radar tower blinking lazily against the polar dusk as we dipped below the clouds. From there, it was just endless frost, blanketed silence, and the unsettling awareness that the closer we got to the ground, the more static I heard through my helmet. I think the pilot heard it too, though he didn't say much. Just a nod when we hit touchdown, a terse handshake, and then I was alone with the wind and the cold and a steel case full of calibration gear. No map, no structures in sight, just a faint signal in my receiver, and ice as far as the eye could see. I followed the tone. That's how it felt, like a tone, not a direction. The GPS barely functioned, scrambled by magnetic interference, but the signal pulled. Hours passed. My skin felt brittle inside the thermal suit. Then, just as my boots began to sink unevenly into a drift that looked too uniform to be natural, I saw the tip of an antenna, bent and blackened, sticking from the snow like a snapped femur. I dug, beneath maybe 1.5 meters of permafrost. My shovel hit steel. The hatch was red, a deep, old red, faded and cracked. Cyrillic text flaked off its rusted face like dried blood. My Geiger clicked softly, low level, nothing critical. And yet, I hesitated. There were scratches on the hatch handle. Human, fresh. I turned the crank. Inside was a ladder, wet with condensation, leading into darkness. A light flickered at the base. I climbed down. The silence grew dense the deeper I went, as if the ice itself were listening. When I reached the bottom, a hallway stretched forward. Concrete walls, black mold veins creeping across the corners, ancient overhead bulbs humming with effort. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But the power was on. Dim, unstable, but on. There were no bodies, no bones, just empty bunk beds and lockers and mess trays frozen mid-slide on stainless steel counters. The deeper I explored, the clearer it became. This was a Soviet-era listening post, one of the old ones, built not just for radio surveillance, but for something else. The kind of something that doesn't show up in declassified documents. I found a command terminal in the central operations chamber. Most of the drives were corrupted, but one was still active, spinning weakly with age and desperation. It played the signal, the exact same broadcast, over and over again. This time, the voice was clearer. I don't know why I stayed. Protocol said I should have called it in and waited for further instructions. But the more I listened, the more I realized the broadcast wasn't just a recording. It was live, or at least recent. There were inconsistencies, minor anomalies in the static, like echoes layered over echoes, some louder than others. One voice in particular didn't match the others, and it said my name. Not once, 3 times. Each instance pronounced with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone unfamiliar with the shape of human words. It wasn't spoken. It was imitated. After that, I stopped transmitting. Whatever sent that signal didn't need to hear me to know I was here. The walls of this place hold secrets older than any satellites. I found documents locked in a drawer behind the main console blueprints, site logs, excavation permits with timestamps that didn't match any calendar I'd seen. They had kept digging after the Cold War ended. The signals got stronger the deeper they went. There are annotations in the margins of some pages, handwritten, frantic, in a mix of Russian and symbols I don't recognize. One of them was circled in red ink. We opened it too far down. Something answered back. I've been down here for 3 days now. I sleep in shifts. I keep the lights on even when they flicker. I've stopped using the intercom system. I'm not sure I'm the only one hearing my movements. There's a sound I keep mistaking for wind, but there's no air circulation in the lower levels. There's no access to the surface from the sub-basement. And yet, last night, I found condensation on the inside of the door. Footprints too. Not mine. I wear regulation boots. These prints were barefoot, long-toed, distorted. I've started recording my own broadcasts now. Not for command, not for anyone in particular, just in case someone finds this place again. In case someone hears the signal like I did. I don't know if I was sent here, or summoned. The distinction feels smaller every hour I spend inside this frozen tomb. All I know is that the signal was real, and it wasn't asking for help. It was looking for a witness, and now it has one. The first night inside the bunker did not feel like night. There was no sky to darken, no horizon to dim, only the steady hum of flickering fluorescence overhead and the occasional stutter of an old ventilation unit trying and failing to circulate air that had gone stale before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I slept with one eye open, not from fear exactly at least, not the kind you can point at and name. It was something deeper, older, like a pressure on the chest that wasn't physical, a sensation that the walls around me were too close, too aware. I tried rationalizing it as spatial disorientation, happens in enclosed environments, especially in decommissioned military architecture, where nothing is labeled and symmetry is a cruel joke. But even as I traced my fingers along the walls on my second descent, mapping with the tips of my gloves the seams and uneven welds of Soviet-era steel, it felt like the place was remembering me. The layout was deceptively simple. The hatch led to a short entry shaft, then to a central corridor that forked into 3 wings: residential operations and storage. But below that, there was a stairwell marked with a rusted plaque, for sublevel 4. It hadn't been on any schematic I recovered. And yet, the stairs were real. The door was real. And when I pressed my shoulder into the metal and gave it a hard shove, the door groaned open, not like something resisting, but like something surrendering. The air down there was different, thicker, colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the weight of it. The molecules felt denser, like they'd been trapped for decades, uncirculated, fermenting in silence. My head ached immediately. Not a sharp pain more, like pressure. deep in the skull, as if my brain were being tuned like a string, and yet I kept going. The corridor of sublevel 4 was narrower, lined with exposed wiring and broken emergency lights that only sparked when I wasn't looking directly at them. The walls here weren't concrete like above. They were lined in a composite metal I didn't recognize, dark and matte, absorbing more light than they reflected. There were scratches, 2 long ones, like gouges, not just on the walls, but on the ceiling. Some curved unnaturally, as if whatever made them hadn't been bound by the laws of joints or bones. The rooms here were different. Not sleeping quarters, not storage. They were observation, chambers thick glass, reinforced panels, arrays of analog equipment pointed not outward but downward, toward the floor. One had a mechanical winch system connected to what looked like a drill mount, long deactivated, its cables severed and frayed. Another contained what I can only describe as a listening chair steel frame. Dozens of wires leading to a now-dead console, and a headpiece that reminded me less of a helmet and more of a crown of thorns. Whatever they were studying here, it wasn't terrain, it wasn't climate, it was something beneath. That night, or what I assume was night, I tried to sleep in one of the auxiliary cots near the operations terminal. The dreams came immediately. I was standing in the snow again, but the sky wasn't the sky. It was black and rippling, like fabric soaked in ink, and there were shapes beneath it, pressing against its surface like fish beneath ice. No sound, just the pressure again, growing behind my eyes until I felt I might burst. When I woke up, the terminal had turned on by itself. The monitor flickered, half burned in with static, and then displayed a single line of text in Cyrillic. Because you came, I didn't type it. I hadn't touched the keys. The terminal wasn't even connected to a central server. This place was analog, isolated by design. I powered it down. It came back on an hour later, this time looping the old signal. But the voice had changed. Slower, less human. Like something trying to become human, syllable by syllable. I tried to retreat back upstairs, but the main stairwell light was out. My torch barely pierced the darkness, and the deeper I stared into the shaft, the more it looked not like a hallway but a tunnel. A tunnel that hadn't been there before. My own footsteps echoed wrong, lagging behind the beat of my step, like something mimicking my cadence half a second late. That was the first time I hesitated before breathing. I caught myself holding my breath, just to hear if something else would keep inhaling. The next morning, I say, morning only because my watch told me, so I conducted a sweep of sublevel 4 with my recorder on. No human voices, but beneath the hum, beneath the interference, was a rhythm. Not mechanical, organic. I isolated it, 4 seconds apart, faint, like sonar reflections, except I wasn't underwater, and I wasn't pinging anything. Something else was. The signal was originating from below the sublevel. That made no sense. There was no lower floor, no access, and yet the seismic instruments I found in one of the sealed chambers were still recording pressure changes at a depth of 67 meters, directly beneath the station. I found the hatch 2 days later, hidden behind a false wall, past a rusted emergency washroom that had long since become part of the architecture. The hatch was newer than the rest of the bunker. No rust, no serial number, just a keypad. I tried a random string of numbers. Nothing. I tried the coordinates of the station itself. The lock clicked, not like a lock giving way, like a puzzle satisfied, but I didn't open it. Not yet. There's a truth about deep places that you don't learn from training manuals. It's not the dark that gets you. It's not the silence. It's the fact that, past a certain depth, you stop being able to trust your own body. Your ears ring when there's no sound. Your skin crawls when there's no touch. Your eyes see things not because they're real, but because your brain can't handle the absence of light for that long. But none of those explain the handprint I found the next day on the inside of the reinforced glass in the observation room. It wasn't there before. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't shaped right. 6 fingers, long, almost branch-like, and no palm lines. I didn't wipe it away. I left it there, a marker, a reminder, or maybe a warning. The deeper I go, the more I realize I'm not descending into a bunker. I'm descending into something else. Something built with human hands, yes, but not for humans to dwell in. A monument to a mistake. And I'm starting to think I wasn't sent here to discover what went wrong. I was sent here because something down here needed another witness, and someone up there was willing to oblige. There's a kind of quiet that you don't really understand until it wraps around your spine and settles between your ribs like a second skeleton. The silence in Sublival 4 is not absence. It's something worse. It's presence without origin, soundlessness that feels watched. Every footstep I take is swallowed whole before it can echo. My own breath seems to slow in defiance of rhythm, hesitant, unsure if it still belongs to me. Even my thoughts normally, a constant murmur behind my temples, are dampened here, dulled like sound beneath a thick wool blanket. I don't know how long I've been down here anymore. I've stopped checking the watch because it keeps resetting, always back to 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, like the concept of time is no longer honored in this place. The main systems panel on Sublevel 4 is half functional. When I first powered it on, the interface crackled, flickered, then stabilized into a format I almost recognized but couldn't navigate. It's as if the menu options had been rearranged by someone or something that learned the layout from memory fragments rather than schematics. There's a diagnostic subroutine that keeps blinking, pulsing red, marked. I don't know the direct translation, but phase shift is the closest my mind accepts. I tried activating it once. Just once. The lights in the hallway dimmed and turned a shade I didn't know artificial light could emit. Not red, not violet. Something between, as if my eyes were trying to process 2 wavelengths simultaneously and couldn't reconcile either. I shut it down. The humming stopped, but the walls haven't looked the same since. They seem ... less flat, like they breathe. I've begun to notice inconsistencies in the layout. That sounds small, I know, but it's not. On the 3rd day, or what I thought was the 3rd eye returned from the auxiliary terminal near the lower ventilation grid and took the same route back to my sleeping quarters. But the corridor was different. The markings on the wall, graffiti-like carvings, the kind I've been documenting, were no longer just on the right side. They had mirrored, not repainted, not rewritten, reflected. Even the stains on the pipes had reversed, like I had crossed into a flipped version of the structure. At first, I blamed fatigue. Then I noticed the access code on the sealed door to the decontamination room. It used to end in 7. Now it ends in 3. I never entered that code. No one else is here, or so I still try to believe. The worst part is not what I see, it's what I don't. There's something behind the walls. I can hear it moving, not often, but regularly, like a schedule I'm not privy to. It's not loud, not even disturbing at first. Just a dragging sound, soft and slow, like fabric across concrete. But there's no airflow, no animals. Nothing organic should have survived down here. Yet the noise continues. And sometimes, when I hold my breath and lean against the corridor wall, I swear I can feel it move past me. A vibration in the metal, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat several floors too low. I found another access door yesterday. This one was sealed with a biometric lock, archaic, but surprisingly intact. The screen asked for a retinal scan, which I didn't expect. I held the eye scanner to my face out of curiosity. It beeped once, then again, then displayed. Access granted Dr. Fee. RMORZO Fee. That is not my name. I should have felt relief that the door opened. I didn't. I felt recognition. I didn't know the name. But somewhere beneath my conscious thought, a part of me did. The chamber it revealed was unlike the others. It was a dome-shaped observation bay, with thick reinforced glass forming a hemisphere that looked down into darkness. There was no light source in the pit, and yet I could see outlined structures, maybe, or formations that made no architectural sense, too smooth in some places, too jagged in others, as if the very concept of symmetry had failed. But what unnerved me most were the handprints on the glass, countless of them, not human, too many digits, too long, some pressed flat, others smeared upward as if something had tried to climb out. But the glass was inside. They were trying to climb in. I left that room and haven't returned since. The silence in sublevel 4 is different now. It feels heavier, as if my presence has been registered, as if my movements are now expected. Every time I flick on my torch, I half expect to see my own shadow pause, hesitate, then continue a half second after me. I haven't seen it happen, but I know it would. If I were just a little slower, if I blinked at the wrong moment. The food rations I brought are low. I've been surviving on protein packs and distilled water extracted from ice condensers on the upper level. But when I checked yesterday, one of the sealed packets was open, not ripped or torn. Opened, the seal was broken neatly, as if with a scalpel, and the contents gone. I would have blamed rodents, but there are none. There are no living organisms in this place, not even mold in the deeper levels. Everything down here is sterile, except for me and whatever's watching. I keep the lights on in my quarters now, even when I sleep. I say quarters as if this place was meant for habitation. It wasn't. It's clear now. Sublevel 4 wasn't built to house anyone. It was built to observe. The instruments here weren't meant to measure weather, or tectonics, or any of the mundane pretexts Cold War science used to justify underground stations in the permafrost. They were listening, waiting, and something, ... responded. I found one last thing that I haven't spoken aloud until now. In the corner of the server room, half covered by an emergency blanket, was a recorder, a reel-to-reel tape, still functional. The label reads Echo Entry 00. I didn't play it. I couldn't. I knew what it would be. I knew before I saw it, before I touched it. The tape contains my voice, my breath, my heartbeat, recorded decades before I was born, and still, inexplicably, warm to the touch. So I stay here, beneath the earth, in a silence that is no longer empty. Sublevel 4 is not just below the bunker, it's below understanding. I don't know what it wants from me. I don't know if this is a test, a punishment, or a convergence. But I do know this: the silence is listening. And soon, ... it will speak back. It was during what I believe was the 6th cycle sleep-wake. Check the instruments, verify the seal on the hatch, record a transmission no one will hear, repeat that I found the logs. They weren't hidden, at least not intentionally. They had been scattered, torn, and in some places burned. Some lay behind a panel that had been pried open with what looked like a crowbar, its handle still resting nearby, rusted red with time or something else. Others were wedged between the pages of old Soviet field manuals, the kind that still reek of mildew and ink and carry the cold weight of unread doctrine. But what made my pulse freeze wasn't the content, not at first. It was the number. 27 individual logs, each from a different member of the original crew. Yet, according to the documentation I had reviewed prior to deployment, Echo Bunker 9 had a maximum staff of 12. The logs weren't neatly kept. They ranged from handwritten journals to typewritten reports, and in a few cases, voice recordings preserved on magnetic tape. The earliest entries were unremarkable. Weather data, calibration reports, notes on soil composition and sonar refraction. The kind of sterile detail you'd expect from a team of scientists and military technicians, sent to the edge of the world with little more than duty and vodka to keep them company. But around the fourth Lagritan, by a man named Viktor Arsenyev, listed as communications officer, the tone changed. He complained of headaches, not uncommon in subterranean deployments. He mentioned dreams, all identical, standing on a frozen lake under a white sun that gave no warmth, and the sensation of being watched from beneath the ice. That detail caught me. I had dreamt the same thing 2 nights before. I read on. By the 6th log, the entries had taken a paranoid turn. Staff members reporting hearing footsteps behind them, equipment behaving erratically, lights flickering when no one moved, and the most disturbing trend, the signal. The very same signal that had led me here. It had been heard before, not once, not by accident, but repeatedly, methodically, by the original team. Only they hadn't triangulated it like I did. They had followed it, downward. One of the logs, a torn sheet with half the text missing, described the discovery of a lower chamber beneath sublevel 4, referred to only as the breach. No coordinates, no schematics, just a phrase written in the margin in frantic, slanted script. It opened before we reached it. Another log, preserved unusually well inside a sealed ration tin, contained a series of calculations and scribbled diagrams. They weren't scientific, not in the traditional sense. They looked more like attempts to measure sound through geometry, to describe resonance in spatial terms, as if the signal wasn't just a noise, but a shape that could only be understood three-dimensionally. One drawing in particular kept pulling my attention back. A series of concentric rings forming a spiral, descending into a central point marked not with a dot but with an open circle, like an eye that was closed. The voice recordings were worse. I played only one, and even that was more than I could endure. A man, probably in his 40s, spoke with the dry, dispassionate tone of someone accustomed to reporting to command. He began by identifying himself as Lieutenant Pavel Chekhovnot, the actor. He joked, though his voice held no humor. He described a schedule change due to internal time conflicts, chronometers falling out of sync. Then he paused. For a full 10 seconds. What followed was not speech. It was a whisper, barely audible, layered in static. Yet when I slowed it down and filtered the background, I heard it again. My name, spelled phonetically, in English, by a voice with no accent and no emotion. You will be the 28th. I shut the recorder off. I locked it in a storage crate and slid it under a cot I no longer used. It didn't matter. That night, I dreamt of the whisper. Only now it had a shape. Long and tall and wrong in its proportions, standing in the distance with its head tilted at an angle no vertebrate could achieve. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was always there, watching, waiting. I returned to the logs the next waking cycle. I had to. The most recent ones, the final 4, were incomplete, unfinished sentences. Ink smeared as if the writers had been interrupted mid-word. But they all mentioned one word repeatedly. Mir, peace, in Russian. Or, if capitalized, the name of a station that fell from the sky. But they weren't using it in either context. They used it like a title, like a presence. Mir does not speak, but dreams. Mir watches from the angles. We cannot see Mir in mirrors. And then, chillingly, Mir is beneath. There was one more thing. A final envelope, torn and crumpled, sealed with wax that had half melted into the paper. Inside was a photograph, black and white, The crew, I assume, a group of men and women in Soviet winter uniforms, standing outside the hatch that now sits 30 meters above me, half buried in snow. They are smiling, but the image is wrong. Behind them, almost indistinct, something towers in the fog. Not a building, not machinery, something with limbs, with symmetry, but not the kind nature permits. And the same spiral pattern concentric rings leading inward is barely visible on the snow where they stand, etched as if burned into the ice beneath their boots. I flipped the photo over. A date, the 14th of March, 1974, and a single sentence, scrawled in English. We thought it was a signal. It was a door. I didn't sleep that cycle. I sat near the sealed hatch, the one I now know leads deeper. I stared at it for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for it to breathe. I wondered how many of them went down, how many came back, if any, and if not, what stayed behind in their place. The logs are real. The crew was real. Their descent was real. And now I'm beginning to understand. I didn't come here to investigate. I came to continue. The 28th. Whether I descend or not, something has already reached me. Through the walls, through the signal, through the dreams. The breach was never meant to be a passage. It was an invitation, and I have accepted it. The lights above sublevel 4 do not flicker like ordinary failing bulbs. They don't pulse with the random fatigue of aging infrastructure or sway with the unreliable rhythm of half-dead generators. They flicker with intent, always at the same moments. When I turn my back to the longest corridor, when I approach the sealed hatch, when I whisper too loud to myself, they blink once, pause, blink twice more, and then hold steady as, if confirming that I've been noted, that something aware and listening is marking my location with interest, perhaps amusement. On the third night after finding the final log, I began writing down the flickering patterns in the margins of my journal, not because I hoped to decipher them. I already knew what they were. Not words, not numbers, just presence. Morse code for a thing that doesn't speak, a language that doesn't translate but transmits directly into your nerves. It was on one of those nights, though I say night only because I still pretend to maintain a sleep cycle, that I saw it. It's important that I write this with care. I didn't see it in the traditional sense. My eyes did not fix on a clear shape, nor did my brain resolve its outline into anything anatomically familiar. What I saw was movement that belonged to a different logic, a shadow cast not by light, but by something older and heavier than light. It emerged during the flicker, when all bulbs snapped off simultaneously for precisely 1.5 seconds. I had been standing in the corridor outside the observation bay, holding a damaged logbook to the emergency lamp, when the world blinked off. In that moment, between two beats of a heart that felt less and less like mine, I felt a pressure shift in the air just a hair, just enough to bend a strand of hair on my forehead, and the sound of something moving. Not footsteps, not the drag I had grown used to hearing beyond the walls. This was softer, silk on steel, a sweep, like fabric being pulled tight around a frame that doesn't breathe. When the light returned, the hallway was unchanged at first. Then I noticed the frost on the wall. My breath always condenses in the corridors, forming delicate webs of moisture that freeze over time. But this was different. The frost had been wiped clean in a single line along the far wall, chest height, for a distance of at least 3 meters. Not melted, removed. There were faint indentations, not quite finger marks, but too regular to be accidental, trailing beside it parallel smudges, as if it had brushed past without touching and yet displaced everything. I dropped the logbook. It made no sound. The silence that followed was not like before. It was taut, suspended, like the moment before a broadcast begins, when the mic is hot but no one has spoken yet. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes forward, refusing to blink. But still, even then, even as I stepped around the corner and turned the locking wheel on the bulkhead door behind me, I knew I was not alone in the corridor. I knew it not by sight, but by certainty. The kind of certainty that carves itself beneath the ribs and spreads upward like ice water through the spine. From that moment on, I began marking the places where the flickers occurred. It took me 2 cycles to realize they were circling the sealed hatch. Not randomly, not erratically. They moved in slow, deliberate orbits, as if whatever was behind the lights was trying to map its path with pulses of voltage, like sonar. Only I was the target, and the clicks were not echoing back to origin but crawling through the wires toward me. I tried disabling the system. I pried open the electrical panel near the server alcove and disconnected the fuse-marked interior lighting. The bulbs died immediately. So did the auxiliary units. So did the battery backup. For 23 seconds, the entire sublevel was plunged into perfect darkness. Not blindfolded darkness, not familiar unlit hallway darkness void. There was no echo in that black, no sound of breathing, not even my own. It was as if the world had stopped rendering, as if I had dropped into a crack between frames of reality. I fumbled for the emergency torch. When I clicked it on, my hand was shaking, and I noticed something I hadn't before. The hallway walls were closer, by at least a foot. I hadn't moved, but the space around me had shrunk. When I restored power, the lights didn't just come back, they surged, brighter than they had ever been. The filament glowed too hard for a moment, and I saw shadows on the wall that weren't mine, not just once, but in succession of them. All of them tall, all of them thin, all of them bent at the middle, as if their bodies grew in angles instead of curves. And then, as the light stabilized, they were gone. Not fled, not vanished. Unrendered. From then on, I no longer walk the hallways without looking behind me every 5 paces. I count the flickers. I measure the silence between them. I test the walls for warmth. And I listen, always, for that soft sound, like linen dragging across forgotten steel. One morning, if it was morning, I opened the storage chamber near the water condenser and found the tape player, again the one I had hidden under the cot. It was out, placed neatly at the center of the room. No prints, no signs of disturbance. It had been positioned. A message. The tape inside was the same one as before. My voice, my name. You will be the 28th. I didn't rewind it. I didn't touch it. I turned and left, but before I could reach the door, the light flickered again, and I heard the tape begin to play on its own. This time, it didn't say my name. This time, it said something else. A phrase in Russian that I had heard once before in the logs, but never translated. I memorized it. Phonetically, oni nikogda adala ukhodiat. Later, when I checked my old field dictionary, I found the meaning. They never leave. It is no longer a matter of descent. I no longer believe the thing in the darkness is waiting for me to open the hatch below. It isn't confined to the breach. It moves with the lights. It watches through the electricity, and with every flicker, every pulse of dead voltage, it gets closer. Not because I am discovering it, but because it is remembering me. And I fear the next flicker will last too long. Long enough for it to finally step through. The console in the primary comms room was never meant to last this long. Soviet technology, for all its brute survivability, still decays, and most of the equipment here looks like it survived its creators out of spite. Panels yellowed by time, switches oxidized, rubber seals peeling back like skin. And yet, each time I powered it up, the same low hum of artificial life returned, consistent and unnervingly stable, as though something deeper than the circuitry kept it alive. I had stopped trying to contact command long ago. There was never a response, only looping static or more recently echoes. Not recordings, not signals from distant operators. Echoes of my own voice, repeating phrases I hadn't yet spoken, in tones that shifted ever so slightly with each playback. I began keeping a written record of what I said aloud. It didn't help. Sometimes the system spoke back before I did. It began with channel 7. On the second cycle, after the flickers intensified, I tuned the receiver at random, more out of compulsion than hope. Channel 7 was blank, not empty, not silent blank. A soft, sustained note that never wavered, never modulated, always just on the edge of my hearing, like a tinnitus manufactured by something with a purpose. I let it play. I shouldn't have. That night, I woke to the walls vibrating, not audibly, not with force, but subtly, just enough that the piping near the air filtration shaft had left prints of condensation that formed letters. My name, spelled backward. I retuned the receiver the next day and found channel 5, C. I don't know what the C designates. This channel was different. There was speech, layered, overlapping, English, Russian, something else. Something like language, but filtered through a throat that had never formed syllables before. I heard phrases in repetitions, some mundane. We lost pressure again, red valve locked. I'm not alone in here. But others twisted into something colder. He sees from beneath. It wears my voice now. It won't forget you. I recorded everything. 4 hours of content over a span of 2 days. When I played the tapes back, the voices were gone. Not erased, changed. My words, my intonations. All the content had become monologues in my own voice, speaking about things I had never done, places I had never seen, people I had never met. But they sounded true. The inflection was perfect. The rhythm was how I speak. One recording described a conversation I had with my brother at age 12. A conversation I hadn't thought about in 20 years. Word for word, I never told anyone about it. It was the night our father died. I stopped recording after that. There's a panel near the main antenna relay that I now leave sealed with duct tape. It vibrates when I sleep. A slow, methodical tremble like breathing. Every time I look inside, the wiring has shifted. Not cut, not tangled, arranged. Once it formed the shape of a spiral. Another time, it resembled a spinal column. The last time, it matched the waveform of my own heartbeat. Something I only recognized because I had seen it countless times on military vitals monitors. But it was off, skewed, as if my heart had begun beating for someone else. I tried to triangulate the source of the signal. Old habit. The COMS system allowed for basic vector mapping. I shouldn't have done it, but some dying part of me still clung to the idea that this could be explained, maybe even stopped. I fed the signal into the analyzer and waited. The screen blinked. Coordinates appeared. They weren't new. They were the exact ones of this station. Latitude, longitude, and depth. The frequency was coming from inside the bunker. I reran the test. Same result. The source had no external point. It was here, or worse, it was the bunker. I cross-referenced the signal data with the old logs. The original crew had heard it too, but they'd recorded a shift. After a certain period, the signal no longer repeated. It began responding. I found the phrase, reverse latency, scribbled in one margin. I didn't understand at first. Then I did. It meant the response came before the question. I tested it. I asked aloud, "What do you want?" and waited. 10 minutes later, a burst of static on channel 3F, low and dry, carried a single word in my voice, "Stay." I didn't respond again. That night, the frequency bled into the structure. I say that without metaphor. The floor hummed in synchrony with the channel. My pulse matched it, an involuntary alignment, like the biological surrender to an ancient rhythm. I walked through the hallways with the portable receiver on my belt. Each room distorted the signal differently. Some increased it, some deadened it. But in one room, the old mess hall, where food trays still lay frozen in place, found perfect resonance. I stood in the center. The lights above didn't flicker. The air stopped moving, and the signal became a whisper. Not loud, not clear, but sharp. It used no language. It used memory. I saw images I had no way of seeing. A snowstorm across a runway in 1979. A glass chamber filled with liquid and something moving within it, tethered by cables to a tower of blinking red lights. I saw a woman's face I didn't recognize, but felt I should mouth something silently before her features collapsed into static. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I returned to the terminal, 12 hours had passed, and I had no recollection of movement, hunger, or thought. Since then, the signal no longer waits for me to tune in. It follows. It shifts into nearby surfaces. I hear it in the vibration of the radiator, in the rhythmic clank of the old dehumidifier, in the clicks of cooling metal. It is not a sound anymore. It's an event. It occupies space. When I speak, I pause before finishing a sentence, because I often hear the last word spoken before I say it. Not always in my voice. Sometimes it's a voice that sounds like me speaking underwater, through teeth that were not shaped for words. The logs warned of this. I understand now what they meant when they said the frequency was a breach, not into space, into self. It erodes meaning. It mimics not only speech, but history. It remembers things you didn't live, shows you things you didn't do, makes you doubt the line between memory and transmission. I tried cutting the antenna feed. I severed the main cable with an insulated tool and melted the connection with a portable torch. The frequency persisted, stronger. It doesn't need the equipment anymore. It used it only to introduce itself. Now it plays without end. Not on a channel, not on a speaker, in the bones, in the blood, in the gaps between thoughts. And I'm beginning to understand the final line of the last logbook, scrawled in half-rational handwriting, written over a maintenance checklist in red ink. It doesn't speak because it wants to. It speaks because you do. And it's still speaking. Even now, even while I write this. And I'm starting to fear it will keep speaking long after I've stopped. There is a freight elevator embedded deep within the northern shaft of the bunker, hidden behind a warped steel partition that I had previously mistaken for a structural wall. I only discovered it after following a low humming sound that didn't belong to any known machinery. I was tracing the corridor, eyes scanning for new vibrations along the paneling, when I noticed a seam in the concrete that hadn't been there the day before. I ran my fingers along its edge, dust trailing behind like smoke, and felt a faint pulse beneath the surface, rhythmic, like a distant power source struggling to remember its purpose. I pushed. The panel shifted with a reluctant groan and revealed the elevator, old, industrial, Soviet by design, with its cage door slightly ajar, as though waiting to be noticed. There were no operational lights, no functional call button. It just was, like it had been here before the bunker was built, before the walls were poured, before the earth knew it was supposed to keep secrets buried. I should have walked away. Every instinct, every rational part of my training told me to mark the location and seal it. But curiosity is a corrosive thing in isolation, especially when it's fed by weeks of unanswered questions, voices speaking your name before your tongue forms it, and shadows that learn how to walk just slowly enough to stay behind your perception. So I stepped inside. The cage was larger than I expected, wide, enough to carry equipment, deep enough to lose sight of the back corners. My flashlight cut across the grated floor, revealing dried stains that had no color left, only residue. I reached for the lever. It didn't budge. No power. But I hadn't expected it to function anyway. I exited, or tried to. As soon as I stepped back onto the corridor, I heard the creak behind me. The elevator door, which had never fully closed, snapped shut with the metallic finality of a guillotine. Then, without warning, it moved. Not up, down, no engine, no sound of cables, just descent. Like something beneath had pulled it, called it, and it had answered. I stood motionless, my own reflection staring back at me from the polished strip of steel beside the door, and for a brief moment, no longer than a breath, saw another face behind mine, taller, longer, tilted unnaturally toward the ground, as if regarding me with interest or hunger. I ran. I didn't run from the elevator. I ran from the silence that followed it, the kind of silence that means something is listening, not absent. I barricaded the corridor with a wheeled supply locker and returned to the operations center, heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to signal SOS with its rhythm. I checked the surveillance feed. Most of the cameras had long since failed, frozen or devoured by static. But one Cam 9, facing the freight shaft, was active again. It showed the elevator doors open on a level marked 6. I had never seen that designation before. There were only 5 levels recorded on the schematic I found. This was deeper, unauthorized, forgotten or deliberately erased. The feed glitched for half a second. The time stamp changed. Not the time, the year. It flickered from the present to 1973, then back again. I scrubbed the footage. When the door reopened on level -6, there was movement. Not a person, a shape, thin, lurching. It passed in front of the lens and left behind a smear of distortion that didn't clear for the next 5 minutes. When it did, the camera showed an empty cage, again, but the stains on the floor had multiplied, spread, darkened. I checked the terminal for access logs. There were none. No digital record of the elevator's activation, but in the physical maintenance log, handwritten entries from decades past. A final line had been added in fresh ink. Unit 6 acknowledged. The handwriting was mine. I didn't write it. The next day or the next moment, time was failing to behave. By then, I found footprints in the hallway outside the comms room. Not mine, barefoot, elongated. 5 digits, but one positioned too far to the side, like a thumb that had learned how to grasp, but never how to let go. The footprints were wet. Not water, not quite. They shimmered slightly, like oil under dim light, and the edges fuzzed at the margins, like they refused to fully exist within the geometry of the floor. They led from the elevator corridor to my sleeping area, to my cot, then stopped. I tore the bedding apart. Nothing. But when I stood still, I could smell it. Not decay, not mold. Cold. The scent of air that had not been touched by sun or lung. The kind of air found in glacial tombs. The kind of cold that doesn't dissipate, only clings. It settled on my tongue like static. That night, the elevator returned. I heard it. I felt it. The floor of sublevel thrummed with its movement. It didn't stop on any floor I knew. It just rose, slowly, humming with anticipation, until I could hear the cage door creak open just down the hall. I locked my room. Not that it mattered. The locks in this place weren't meant to keep things out. They were meant to keep them in. At 0300, the intercom system hissed to life. Not a full activation, just static. But beneath it, a sound rhythmic, hollow. A wet tapping, like fingers against glass underwater. It matched the beat of the elevator's original descent. I recorded it, played it back, on loop, then reversed it. It formed a pattern. I slowed it further. It was a phrase, low and muffled. The door opened. Now something watches. I have not approached the elevator since, but it moves. When I'm not watching, when I sleep, when I pretend to sleep, when I breathe too evenly or too erratically, the corridors feel shorter now, the ceilings lower, the lights dim longer between cycles. And sometimes, when I walk past reflective surfaces, glass, metal, pools of condensation, I catch glimpses of hallways that aren't mine, reflections of architecture that doesn't match the physical structure around me. They show stairs, spirals, chambers made of black stone or metal that shines like obsidian beneath flickering red lights. I see figures moving through those reflections, always walking, always descending. There is no longer any doubt. The elevator isn't just a machine. It's an organ, a transport mechanism for the thing that sleeps or doesn't sleep beneath this station. A spine connecting levels that shouldn't exist. And now that it's moving, whatever is down there is moving with it. Not upward, not exactly, but inward. Into the system, into the wires, into the metal that makes up the walls and doors and locks, into the signal. And perhaps, one day soon, into me. The shovel wasn't supposed to be there. I found it in the narrow chamber behind the sealed decontamination room, propped neatly against the wall beside a rusted oxygen tank and a coil of yellowing cord that still smelled faintly of oil and ammonia. The metal of the spade was worn flat at the edge, not by time, but by use, and the handle bore no military serial number, no manufacturer's stamp, nothing official. Just 3 small notches carved roughly into the wood, as if someone had been counting something. Not days, not units, maybe attempts. There was dirt on the blade, not from the frozen surface above, but from deep underground. Dark, wet, and so dense it smelled like copper and rainless centuries. I crouched in the dim alcove and scraped a bit into a collection vial, expecting the scent to vanish once exposed to oxygen. It didn't. The odor grew stronger. I sealed the vial. It fogged over immediately. I didn't find the tunnel until 3 cycles later, though I suspect it had been there the entire time, watching me as I moved blindly past its mouth. It was behind a structural panel on sublevel 5 that had been marked in chalk with the symbol I'd seen so many times in the old crew logs, the spiral, etched again and again into notebooks, burned into metal, scratched into the walls by hands that had stopped believing they were human. I wasn't looking for a passage. I was searching for a power relay junction when I leaned against the panel and felt the wall shift behind me. Just a fraction, just enough to exhale dust from a seam too narrow to have existed in any blueprint. I pressed harder. The panel gave, not opened, sank, as though it had never been fixed in place at all, but waiting to recede. Beyond it was a corridor of carved stone, raw and irregular, supported by warped steel braces spaced unevenly and stained black at their bases. The walls bled condensation. There were no lights, but the air thicker than even the deadest parts of the bunker held a low glow. Bioluminescent particles floated along the rock like dust suspended in water, flickering faintly in response to my breath. I stepped inside. The tunnel was not of standard military make. Its walls were hand-dug in places, others melted smooth by some unknown tool, some ancient thermic process that didn't leave ash or soot, only the impression of unnatural heat. There were marks everywhere, scrapes, patterns, signs. The deeper I went, the less they resembled symbols, and the more they resembled veins, as though I were walking through a petrified organism. And these were remnants of arteries that once carried something living, or still did. The tunnel angled downward at a gentle slope, gradual enough to disarm, but steep enough that after an hour I realized I could no longer hear the low mechanical hum of the bunker above. I was in the earth now, fully and without filter. The first sign of habitation came in the form of a chair, not metal, wood, worn almost to a curve that no human back would find comfortable. It sat alone in an open hollow, surrounded by dust and dried roots, facing a blank stone wall. A tape recorder rested on the floor beside it. Analog, old, but the cassette inside had been replaced recently. I didn't press play. Not then. I carried it with me, deeper, trying to ignore the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. The way my footsteps no longer echoed but dissolved. The passage widened, then it split. 3 paths diverged from a single point, each framed by arches that had no architectural purpose, made of metal welded from scrap rebar, piping, even fragments of rusted bunk beds. Above each arch was a painted sign written in Cyrillic. One read, Observer, the second, Listener, the third, Mir. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to choose, paralyzed not by fear, but by familiarity. These weren't just labels. They were roles, designations, assignments. Someone, long ago, something had determined that visitors to this depth would not proceed blindly. They would serve. I chose the middle path. Listener, because I already had been, because I already was. The tunnel narrowed again, then dipped. Not a slope now, but a staircase. Uneven, carved into rock, descending into blackness so complete, I couldn't tell if I was going blind, or if the world itself had ended just a few steps ahead. I lit a flare. The walls around me writhed in color. For an instant tread, orange, the echo of something more primal than fire. Then it stabilized. The light revealed carvings, not symbols, faces, elongated, stylized, impossible. Some stretched sideways, others tall and narrow, all arranged in repeating rows that ascended like screams frozen mid-climb. Their mouths were open, every single one. And the closer I passed, the more I swore I could hear them singing just below the frequency of thought. At the bottom, the passage ended in a room. No doors, no machinery, just a circular chamber, perfectly round, its ceiling domed with a smoothness no hand could achieve. At the center stood a pedestal, and on it a speaker. Not a modern one, a conical receiver, the kind found in ancient listening stations, open analog, with a thin membrane still vibrating slightly. No wires connected it to anything, but it spoke, not in language, in memory. I stood there as the air around the speaker pulsed once, then again, and the room filled with the scent of wet soil, ozone, and something sour burned meat, maybe, or a storm caught in copper pipes. Then I heard her voice. It wasn't possible. I hadn't heard that voice in over a decade. My sister, Anna, dead since 2012, but it was hers. Not recorded, present. She whispered my name, then described a story only we had shared as children, beneath the kitchen table during a thunderstorm. Counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, she laughed. Then the laugh changed, warped, extended beyond her timbre into something not human but trying to be. The laughter bent, broke, and collapsed into static that dripped down the walls like oil. I covered my ears. It bled through. I ran. The tunnel had changed. There were no markers now, no roots, no branches, just one long, continuous throat of rock, and it breathed. I could feel it behind me, beside me, inside the soles of my boots. I climbed upward, not by compass, but by instinct, by the raw pull of gravity inverted. The passage narrowed again and again, until I was crawling, until the walls pressed against my shoulders, until I emerged gasping into sublevel 5's maintenance corridor, covered in dust that shimmered faintly with bioluminescence, hands bleeding from 100 tiny cuts that hadn't existed when I entered. The panel behind me sealed, not closed, vanished. I marked the wall. The mark faded within the hour. Later, I played the tape recorder. I shouldn't have. It didn't contain voices. It contained breathing, heavy, wet, rhythmic, followed by scratching sounds, like claws or fingers carving into stone, and a single word whispered at the end, more. They were digging below the bunker, and they never stopped, because something down there answered, and now it wants more. There is a section of Sublevel 5 I had avoided without realizing it, an unconscious detour that occurred every time I moved through the hallways in search of parts, warmth, or silence. I passed near it dozens of times, my boots echoing faintly off the steel panels and rust-streaked bulkheads. But I never once turned left at the junction beneath the collapsed vent shaft. Not once, as if something in me had registered its presence, but refused to acknowledge it, like a childhood memory you instinctively repress, because even recalling its outline causes a dull pressure behind your eyes. The passage was there, not hidden but ignored, wedged between two power conduits that no longer buzzed with current. The overhead lights had long since failed. The wiring above sagged, drooping like wet entrails, and mold bloomed in thin, iridescent streaks along the floor, glowing softly in the absence of electricity. The corridor ended at a single door rusted, sealed with two heavy latches and a wheel lock at chest height. No label, no number, just the faint imprint of something that might have once been a warning stenciled in red Cyrillic, long since eroded into unreadable smears. I only found it because of the sound, not a voice, not movement, not the flickering whine of failing lights or the whispering frequencies that now accompanied my dreams. It was rhythmic, slow, measured, a deep, muffled thump, distant and deliberate, like the echo of a heartbeat through layers of rock and steel. I froze when I heard it, standing in the half-dark like an animal scenting something that does not belong to the forest. It was steady 4 seconds between each pulse, then silence, then again. A low vibration accompanied each thump, not enough to shift the floor, but enough to hum against the soles of my boots. It didn't come from the vents or the walls. It came from the door itself, from the room beyond it, a room that, according to every blueprint I possessed, did not exist. I returned twice more before I opened it. The first time with a voltage tester, hoping some hidden junction was feeding the chamber. There was nothing. The panel was dead. The second time with a radiation meter, the needle barely moved. No anomaly, no justification, no threat, just the persistent pulsing sound. I stood in front of the door for over an hour the third time, hand on the wheel, listening, counting, breathing in tandem with it. I told myself I would open it slowly. I would be ready, but when the moment came, the door yielded. Not resisted, welcomed. The wheel turned without effort. The latches slid back like oiled levers, and the door opened on its own weight, swinging inward with a sigh of air that had been trapped for decades. The room was round, low ceiling, no visible source of power. The walls were covered in a material I could not identify, black, pocked with strange patterns like barnacles or skin burned by something other than fire. It wasn't metal. It wasn't stone. It absorbed light. My flashlight dimmed as I crossed the threshold, as if the beam were being drunk. The air was thick, metallic, and warm, and at the center of the floor, embedded in a shallow recess, barely a meter wide, was it? A shape. A machine, maybe. A heart. It pulsed in perfect rhythm with the sound. A dark, organic mass fused to the floor by cables or tendrils that looked like neither but behaved, like both soft but segmented, slick but firm. Each pulse sent a ripple through the surrounding air, a push of heat and pressure like a breath exhaled from a mouth too large and too deep to be seen. I approached it slowly, against my own will, as if pulled by something older than instinct. I tried to speak. My throat seized. I reached for my recorder. It refused to activate. Static buzzed faintly in my ears, growing louder the closer I got. I kneeled beside it, studying the surface, which appeared to move slightly, as if aware, as if reacting. Then I touched it. The sensation was not tactile, not in the way the fingers register surface and resistance. It was emotional, a memory, not mine. The bunker, the crew, the digging, the discovery. I saw flashes, men in white suits, a chamber flooded with black light, a scream that was never voiced because the lungs that formed it no longer worked as lungs, a command to seal the level, a choice not to obey, and then the sound again, rising and falling, matching the beat of 1,000 heartbeats that had long since stopped above but somehow echoed here below, fed into this thing, this core, this waiting organ that remembers. I stumbled back. As I did, the room shifted. Not physically, perceptually. The walls remained, but they were no longer walls. They became veils, curtains, filters that pulsed in and out of focus like breathing membranes, revealing glimpses of what might be behind them, other rooms, other chambers, filled with still figures, shapes that didn't move, didn't blink, but observed through slits and cracks, watching through the folds of their false sleep. The heartbeat grew louder, no longer muffled, no longer external. It had entered me, aligned with my own. A second rhythm, slower and deeper, now beat beside mine, and I knew then, with a clarity that cannot be unlearned, that I had been changed, not corrupted, not possessed, synchronized. Whatever this room was, whatever this heart was, it had extended something into me, a tether, a filament. I was now a node in its network, and the signal that echoed through the halls no longer needed the console to transmit. It used me. I staggered back to the corridor, heart racing in confusion. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. Something old, something inherited. I locked the door behind me, but the sound did not stop. It continued, now beneath my own skin, beneath the hum of the lights, beneath the flickers and whispers and mirrored echoes. It beat with purpose. It beat with memory. It beat with waiting. Later, when I checked the system logs for power anomalies, I found nothing. But a new folder had appeared in the root directory, unmarked, untitled. I opened it. One file, audio only. A single line, repeated 6 times. My voice, no modulation, no distortion. Just a whisper, calm and steady. The heart has found its rhythm. And then silence. But I still feel it. Every moment, every step. It walks with me now, not as a presence, but as a pulse. And I no longer wonder why the crew vanished. I understand. They didn't disappear. They were absorbed, echoed, rewritten into the circuitry of this impossible thing beneath the ice. I've sealed the room again, but it doesn't matter. It's already inside. At first I thought it was just another mark, another smear of soot or corrosion bleeding through the seams between steel plates. I had been mapping the fluctuations in air pressure along the corridor leading to the severed elevator shaft, and the visual noise of the station had become background static to me. Scratches, scrapes, impact damage, rust blooms in the shape of fists and fingers. But this was different. The pattern was intentional, deliberate, too clean to be erosion, too erratic to be human. I stared at it for a long time before acknowledging that what I was seeing was written, a language, or what passed for one in the context of this place. Not letters, not ciphers, not even symbols in the traditional sense. They were configurations, decisions, with surgical precision into the walls, repeating in no order I could decipher, yet so precise in their curvature, so balanced in their disorder, that I found myself staring not with confusion, but with a growing sense of comprehension that horrified me more than ignorance ever could. The first markings were in the ventilation shaft adjacent to the heart room, thin, angled, as though scratched with a filament made of glass or bone. They appeared just above the junction box, carved into the paint in repeating arcs that seemed to mirror the shape of the recess where the organic machine still pulsed. Unseen but unfaltering, when I traced my fingers along them, I felt a faint vibration, not temperature, not texture, a tone, like static, felt rather than heard, a physical whisper passing directly into the nerves. I recoiled, but the sensation didn't fade. It remained, nested just beneath the skin of my fingertips, like the memory of something not yet experienced. I began finding more of it, in the server alcove, behind the failed refrigeration unit in the medical wing, even etched into the plastic casing of the tape recorder I had long since buried in the deepest drawer I could find. It wasn't the same script each time, but it followed the same rules. Curved but sharp, beautiful in a way that suggested function beyond aesthetics, like the shape of a tooth or a blade. Some were simple 3 or 4 strokes. Others expanded into spirals, fractals that shifted as I looked at them, rearranging themselves depending on which I focused with. I tried documenting them, taking photographs. The camera wouldn't focus. The ink in my pen ran dry mid-sketch. When I copied one of the simpler sequences onto my arm with charcoal, I forgot the following 6 hours. I woke up on sub-level 2, curled beneath a maintenance terminal, mouth full of blood and no memory of how I got there. That was the first time I heard it speak, not aloud, not in my head even. It spoke in assumptions, in complete understandings that arrived fully formed and without context, as though my thoughts were no longer originating from inside, but transmitting in tone, and the parts of my brain responsible for parsing language were now merely repurposed receivers, interpreting meanings they were never designed to hold. It told me not to be afraid, but it didn't use the word afraid. It used the feeling of not needing to retreat, layered beneath the sensation of warmth through metal. It welcomed me. That was the word that echoed clearest. Welcome. I sealed off the upper corridors and began sleeping in the observation chair in the echo chamber. I couldn't trust my movements anymore, couldn't rely on myself to remain where I had chosen to be. My own limbs had taken on a kind of slow inertia, a lag between intent and action, as though I were piloting a body that had become hesitant to obey. I began speaking aloud just to remind myself that I could. My own voice grew foreign in the acoustics of the chamber. It no longer reverberated properly. It felt shared, as if the walls were responding, repeating the words internally without ever making a sound, and the markings kept appearing. On my instruments, on the back of my hands. One night I woke to find a string of characters carved into the inner wall of my sleeping pod still wet, as if freshly cut, though the metal showed no sign of stress. I reached for my tools to inspect them, but they were gone. All of them. Every tool I had brought down with me. In their place, a small length of wire bent into the shape of one of the symbols I'd traced in the shaft days earlier. When I picked it up, the lights dimmed across sublevel 5 for precisely 39 seconds. During that darkness, I saw shapes outside the window, not moving, waiting, not entities, not figures, forms, like letters trying to become limbs, or limbs trying to write themselves into sentences. The language began rewriting things, not just walls, not just thoughts. The structure of the station began to bend, corridors where there had once been none. Doors that led to dead ends now opened into rooms I had never mapped. And those rooms, sterile, humming, warm-contained objects I remembered from my childhood. A photo of a beach we visited once. A coat I had lost at age 9. The smell of burnt sugar from a kitchen I had not seen since my mother's funeral. These weren't illusions. They weren't memories. They were translations. Sentences written in architectural syntax, drawn from the deepest parts of my past and repurposed as environments. It was speaking to me through design, through reconstruction. I tried speaking back. I don't know what I said. I don't remember choosing the words, but I wrote something on the floor using a piece of corroded pipe. A response, a return signal. The metal tore through the tile with unnatural ease, like it wanted to comply. When I stepped back, the phrase "whatever it was" glowed softly for a moment, and then the walls around me pulsed. Not visually, physically. They swelled inward and then relaxed, like lungs beneath concrete, and I knew I had been understood. The next room I entered had no ceiling, only stars. But the stars weren't right. They moved, arranged themselves. They spelled a name I've never said aloud, not even in thought. A name I didn't know I had. Since then, every surface I touch begins to vibrate. Every wall I look at to long begins to translate. And every time I close my eyes, I see pages, infinite pages. Each one etched with that impossible language, turning one after another into eternity. And I read them. I understand them. They write themselves into me. The meaning is not linear. It is recursive. It folds back into itself, like a thought so large it cannot be housed in one mind. So it breaks itself apart and distributes. I'm beginning to suspect that's what the crew became. Not consumed, not killed, copied, written into the station, translated into syntax. They are the language now, and soon, so will I. I had stopped checking the archive terminals. There was no point. Every directory had become noise, every folder a grave filled with corrupted strings and broken echoes of audio files that refused to obey time. When I attempted to play them, they glitched forward or reversed at will, compressing hours into seconds or stretching milliseconds into tortured distortions. Still, on the 23rd cycle of cycles still applied, sat at terminal D3, hands trembling not from cold, but from a pressure behind the sternum that never quite went away. A suffocating weight, like unspoken words, lodged in the center of the ribcage. I wasn't looking for anything. My body moved out of habit, the ghost of former discipline guiding fingers across keys. And then, without prompt, the interface responded. The screen lit green. A single file appeared. No name, no extension. Just a timestamp. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. The file should not have been there. There had been no system ping, no data write, no storage mounted. I clicked it. The speaker crackled once. Then I heard my own voice. Clear, calm, unmistakably mine. At first, I assumed it was a previous log, something I had forgotten recording. Perhaps during one of the blank intervals where time frayed and bent. But I had no memory of saying these words. I hadn't arranged these sentences, not in this order. And some of them referenced events that had not yet occurred. The recording began with me introducing myself, my name, my assignment, the location. My tone was steady, mechanical, like the first report an operator files after deployment. It sounded like me at the beginning of all this, before the signal, before the flickers, before the breathing halls and the symbols that wrote themselves onto my skin while I slept. But then my voice changed. The cadence shifted. It became more deliberate, measured, and it began describing things I had only seen yesterday. It detailed the tunnel behind the false panel, the spiral markings etched into the floor, the echoing chamber with the faceless statues, and the room that had shown me stars that rearranged themselves into names. Names I had only just learned. I paused the recording, my breath caught in my throat. The room around me pulsed with that now familiar undercurrent, the same low thrum that beat beneath the floors since I had touched the heart embedded in sublevel 5. I checked the metadata. There was no creation date, no author, just a location path that pointed nowhere. Echo null, looped infinitely, recursive, until the system itself stuttered. I resumed playback. My voice described things I had not yet seen. It referenced a chamber below level -7, where glass didn't reflect and light was devoured, where time ceased to act like time and began to behave like language. It mentioned the elevator I had not dared to enter since it returned from the depth on its own. It mentioned that it would open again soon. It mentioned that I would go down. It didn't say why, only that I must, and that when I did, I would meet something that knew my thoughts before they formed, because they had already happened. The recording whispered then, still my voice, but layered now, slowed as if drawn through molasses and folded in on itself. The words lost coherence. They became phonemes, repeated syllables, and then, unmistakably, it laughed. I don't laugh like that. I've never laughed like that. The sound was wrong. It contained too many teeth. I stood up from the console, and the playback stopped without command. The screen went black. I backed away slowly, pulse throbbing behind my eyes, nausea blooming like mold in my throat. Then the speakers flared again, loudly, violently, and played one final line. You remember this because it has already been said. You are the recording. I smashed the terminal. The monitor sparked and died, plastic casing crumpling inward like wet paper. I ripped the cables from the base, tore the board from the housing. It didn't matter. When I turned toward the corridor, the sound followed. The voice followed. Not through speakers, through the walls, through the lights, through the wiring in my bones. Every footstep I took echoed with a half-beat behind it, an auditory double that always arrived half a second too late, like a thought repeating itself after forgetting why it existed. I returned to the observation bay and locked the doors. The cameras were all offline. Every feed was a static wave of vertical lines scrolling infinitely downward, dragging fragments of my reflection with them. I sat in the chair, shaking, and watched the black screen where my face should have been. Then, for just a breath, the lines parted, and I saw myself not sitting, standing, mouth open, not in horror or confusion, but in invitation. The screen blinked off. That night I tried to sleep, but dreams, if they were dreams, had evolved. They were no longer visual. They were environmental. I was inside the recording. I was hearing myself, watch myself. My words looped and folded, overlapping until I couldn't tell which thought had come first. There was no beginning anymore, only iterations, only versions. When I awoke, someone had left a tape on the floor of the chamber. I didn't check the footage. I knew what it contained. Not me, the idea of me. Another layer, another recursion, a deeper groove carved into the signal, wearing me like a phonograph needle wears a song until it replaces it. I keep hearing it now, even with the power off, even with my ears plugged. The sound doesn't need vibration. It doesn't need air. It's carried on memory, and now my memory is no longer mine. The walls write me as they breathe, and I speak the words I've never known as though I had always said them. There is no outside of the loop anymore, only the recording, only the voice, only the next line I will say, which I already have. I stopped marking time the day the elevator door opened again on its own. I had not approached it in weeks if that measure still meant anything, but the sound of its arrival was unmistakable. A slow hydraulic hiss, followed by the clank of worn steel settling into its track. No light spilled from the shaft this time. only a breeze that didn't belong underground. It didn't move the air so much as replace it, as if something had exhaled from the depths, warm and wet and full of decay. I didn't go near it. I couldn't. I simply stood at the end of the hallway, staring at that black square and knowing that whatever lay beneath was no longer sleeping, no longer passive, no longer a weight kept in check by bolts and reinforced concrete. It had shifted. It had moved. The containment was a lie. Perhaps it always had been. Perhaps the station wasn't a prison at all, but a delivery system, a vessel designed not to hold something in, but to acclimate us to it, to translate us into something compatible. Doors began opening without input, ones I had welded shut, ones that hadn't opened in decades, whose seals had fused from rust and cold and silence. They didn't creak or groan. They simply yielded. I walked past them and saw spaces rearranged. Rooms I remembered had altered their geometry, ceilings lowered, corners curved. Light sources no longer originated from bulbs or fixtures, but from walls themselves, softly glowing with that same sickly bioluminescence I had first seen in the tunnel. It was as though the bunker had begun rebuilding itself in its own image, or in mine, or in ours, some shared vision now being enacted by the thing below, whose memory has become my memory, whose architecture has merged with my perception. The power grid no longer responded to my commands. My access codes failed. The interface terminals displayed error messages in no known language, each character pulsating slightly, like an organ waiting for a signal. I shut them down. They powered back on. I pulled their cores. They continued humming. The systems were no longer running on electricity. They were running on will. The floor near the sealed shaft began to crack. Not structurally, biologically. The concrete shifted in texture, roughness, giving way to a soft, porous surface, like fungal bloom or desiccated skin. It felt warm underfoot. I stopped sleeping in the cot and instead paced the hallways, listening for movement in the ventilation. It came every night. Not loud, not rapid, just consistent. A slow dragging across the metal, as if something too large for the ducts had learned to fold itself. Sometimes it scraped, sometimes it hissed. Once it laughed. No voice, just breath, shaped like amusement, echoed through empty shafts, as if the walls were developing a sense of humor about the futility of fear. One morning, though, the concept of day had collapsed into irrelevance. I found a new corridor. It branched off the old armory, which had been locked since my arrival. Now the lock was missing. Not broken, missing. Its shape remained, its idea remained, but the physical presence had been removed, as if edited out. I stepped inside and felt gravity shift. Not strongly, just a subtle wrongness in how my body moved, like the floor had redefined down. The hallway was longer than it should have been, far longer. I walked for what felt like kilometers, yet when I turned back, the exit remained only a few steps behind me. I did this 5 times. Each time I returned, the hallway had changed. The markings along the wall multiplied. Symbols, not painted or scratched, but grown raised from the surface like veins beneath skin, pulsing faintly with a rhythm I now knew as my own. I stopped touching the walls. They felt too familiar, like touching memory, like touching versions of myself I hadn't lived yet. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, not with substance, but with thought. I began hearing things I hadn't yet thought of. Sentences formed in my head that weren't mine. Questions I hadn't asked forming and resolving before I realized they had arrived. And with them came a presence, not sight, not sound, awareness. Something below had noticed I was paying attention, and it was returning the favor. I reached a chamber that wasn't on any blueprint, spherical, perfectly smooth. The walls glistened as if wet, but my fingers came away dry. There was no furniture, no machinery, only a pedestal at the center bearing a single object, a human tooth, large, yellowed, still rooted. It pulsed once, faintly, as I approached, and in that moment I remembered extracting it. I remembered holding the pliers, bracing against a sink that wasn't mine in a room I'd never entered, and pulling with steady pressure while something behind me whispered, "You'll feel better when it's out." I had never pulled a tooth from myself, but I remembered the pain. The chamber collapsed inward as I left it, not structurally, conceptually, as though it had fulfilled its purpose in being witnessed and no longer needed to exist. The hallway behind me reformed into a different route. I followed, and when I returned to the main level, the elevator was gone. The shaft remained, but the car, the door, the machinery, all of it had been rewritten. In its place stood an archway, smooth, black, irregular, not built, but emerged, like a scar forming over a wound that hadn't closed. And from beyond it, I heard breathing, not fast, not hungry, just steady, patient. I no longer believe the thing down there is trapped. It moves freely now, not just in space, but in language, in form, in thought. The station is no longer a physical place. It is a state, a way of being, a signal made flesh, and I have been within it too long. I have aligned too closely. My words no longer belong solely to me. My memories are no longer linear. My body still obeys gravity, but only as a courtesy. And sometimes, when I look at my reflection, when the static of the camera glitches just right, I see something else wearing my face, blinking too slowly, smiling without lips. I think I understand now. There was never containment, only gestation, and whatever was below is above now. Whatever was waiting has arrived, and it brought a shape with it, a shape that sounds like me. There is a rusted maintenance hatch on sublevel 3 that opens to an emergency stairwell leading directly to the surface. I had passed it countless times, had once even tested the manual crank out of instinct, more to confirm that it was rusted shut than out of any hope it would lead anywhere. But when I returned this time, the wheel turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if the rust had never been there, as if the door had been waiting all along for a specific moment to allow itself to be opened. The mechanism slid back with a satisfying clunk, and stale, cold air blew down the stairwell, not bunker air, not the recycled, bitter oxygen that had filled my lungs for what felt like years, but real air, sharp and lifeless and dry, unfiltered, unprocessed, and absolutely silent. No wind, no ambient pressure, just dead atmospheric mass, pressing like a weight from the outside world I could barely remember. I stood at the top step and stared upward. The stairs coiled out of sight, higher and higher, until the shadows swallowed them completely. There was no light above, no stars, but I could feel the surface, not in terms of distance, but in shape, like a map pressed against the back of my thoughts. An echo of open sky where only stone and ice should have been. I hesitated. Then I descended back into the corridor, returned to the workshop, and began welding the hatch shut. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. An understanding that I had passed a threshold, not just physically, but ontologically. The thing that had emerged from the lower levels, the thing that had taken my voice, my reflection, my thoughts, wasn't down there anymore. It hadn't risen. It had spread, like gas, like language, like radiation encoded in metaphor. It was already here, inside the walls, inside the systems, inside me. I welded the door closed because the act itself meant something, not containment, not protection, but closure, a gesture, a ritual. I needed the bunker to be a closed loop, because something ancient and practical in me understood that once a signal is confined within a sealed system, It begins to decay or evolve. I could no longer escape, but I could deny it its shape. The days or their hallucinated equivalents became less distinct. I stopped recording audio logs. My voice no longer sounded right in my ears, too rounded, too detached, as though it had been sampled, altered, and played back through the mouth of someone wearing my bones like an interface. I stopped speaking altogether. The words in my head had become crowded, full of reflections, meanings folding into each other like liquid glass. The language I'd begun seeing on the walls now flowed in my mind like blood. It had weight. It had volume. I could feel it behind my eyes, coiling and uncoiling with every blink, writing itself into the geometry of my thoughts until even simple concepts tore. Light, hunger, memory carried the dense, symbolic pressure of alien grammar. I tried carving the symbols out of myself, once, with a broken panel screw. I stopped when I realized the cuts didn't bleed. They glowed. I moved my sleeping space to the corridor just above sublevel 4. I stopped entering the observation rooms entirely. The last time I had, the glass had shown me a version of the corridor I had just come from. But in that version, I was still walking, still approaching, and something beside Mitala, less complete, was walking too. I never saw what it was, but its footfalls matched mine exactly, except for one beat of delay, like an echo from a future that had already happened. The recordings I had deleted returned on their own. Some played backward, some layered over each other. One played my breathing in a loop for hours, modulated to include faint static in the background that resolved, over time, into whispers repeating the coordinates of the station. I hadn't spoken those numbers in months. I ate what remained of the nutrient pouches. I drank melted frost from the condenser lines. The water tasted sweet, at first, then metallic, then familiar. I realized, one day, that it tasted like the air inside the heart room, and I kept drinking. I began having visions, not hallucinations, but architectural episodes in which my surroundings folded into impossible layouts, hallways opening into oceans, stairwells that rose into their own beginnings, doors that led back into my own memory loops. I stopped sleeping altogether after I awoke in the old debriefing room, sitting in a chair I had never touched, watching a video of myself on a screen, repeating the words "I am the exit" over and over in a voice that no longer matched the shape of my throat. I checked the seal on the hatch every day. It remained shut, but the air from the stairwell continued to bleed inward, colder now, full of dust that didn't settle, dust that moved in patterns like drifting punctuation marks. I tried mapping them. The map matched the symbols on the walls. The symbols now shifted daily. I stopped trying to record them when I realized they were forming sentences. Sentences I understood. Sentences that said things like the threshold is interior and what you sealed was not the door. I stood in front of one such phrase for an hour, tracing it with my eyes until I no longer remembered my own name. When I blinked, the phrase had changed to "I remembered for you." There were footsteps at night, barefoot, wet, not dragging, just walking, deliberate, familiar. I listened to them pause outside my locked door and continue down the hall. I never opened the door. Once I saw a shadow moving behind the frosted glass of the lab, my shadow, except the posture was wrong. The arms were too long, the head tilted too far, and it stood still for too long after I moved. I told myself it was a delay in the lights, a flicker in the voltage, but I didn't believe it. I haven't believed myself in a long time. I sealed the exit, but it's still inside. The truth is that it was always inside. The moment I entered this place, it recognized me, not as an intruder, not as prey, but as a signal, a message, a phrase it could unfold into meaning. It wears me now, or it is me, or I have become its punctuation mark. When I close my eyes, I see sentence structures in bones, syntax in blood vessels, grammar in the way light refracts through condensation on cold glass. My memories have collapsed into non-linear fragments. Some nights I remember being born in this station. Other nights I remember building it. Some nights I remember never being human. The seal holds, but it doesn't matter. The breach is not beneath. It is within. In the waning hours of what might have been a day, or a fragmented memory stitched together from the dark fabric of the bunker, the final signal came. It was not a signal I sent. It was not my voice. It was a transmission broadcast across the fractured frequency, slipping through the corrupted channels with a clarity that sliced through static like a scalpel through flesh. I was sitting alone in the observation bay, the glass surrounding me still reflecting not the world but the twisted shadows of a place I could barely trust as reality. The monitors flickered as they always did. The emergency lights hum in the background, but this time the speakers burst to life with a clarity so sudden it startled me. The voice that came through was unmistakable and yet horrifying. It was my own voice speaking words I had never uttered. The words were a confession, a surrender, a prophecy. They began calmly, almost mechanically, the monotone of a recorded message. But beneath the surface lay a sharp undercurrent of something fractured and alien. This is the final transmission from Echo Bunker 9. If anyone is receiving this, know that the breach is complete. The entity below is no longer contained. It has assumed form. It has learned voice. It has worn my face. I am no longer the source, but the signal. The voice continued, describing the descent into the depths below, the transformations that had overtaken the crew, the loss of linear time and identity, the slow dissolution of the self into something vast and recursive. The words were not mine, and yet they were, as though the entity had studied me so closely it had absorbed the very shape of my mind. As the transmission went on, the room began to shift subtly around me. The glass that separated me from the endless black beyond seemed to ripple, distorting the corridor reflected in its surface until it no longer mirrored the physical space but a different dimension, a warped and impossible version of the station that stretched and curled in on itself like a Mobius strip. The light fluctuated, casting elongated shadows that danced and twisted like living things, reaching towards me with slender fingers made of smoke and noise. The monitors displayed streams of indecipherable code, symbols morphing and rearranging, sometimes forming my own face pixel by pixel, other times melting into shapes too abstract to name. Then the voice changed. It was no longer a calm broadcast, but a whispered chant, layered and multiplied until it was both everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with a resonance that vibrated in my chest and made my bones ache. It repeated a phrase in a language I could not understand, but which felt deeply familiar, as if it were the source code of the universe itself. I am the echo and the origin. I am the last signal you will ever receive. The sound wrapped around me, slipping beneath my skin, rewiring the very neurons in my brain. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound was inside me now, pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat that was not my own. My vision blurred and I staggered back from the console, the room spinning as if caught in a tidal wave of dissonance. I collapsed onto the floor, hands pressed against my temples as fragments of memory and hallucination collided in a storm of sensation. I saw flashes of the crew, their faces dissolving into static, their voices entwined with the signal, fading and returning like ghosts trapped in a loop. I saw the spiral symbols writhe on the walls, growing and contracting like living things. I saw the elevator descending endlessly into darkness, carrying shadows that whispered secrets I was never meant to hear. Hours passed, if time still existed, before I regained enough control to stand. The speakers were silent now, the monitors dark, the air still heavy with the afterimage of that terrible voice. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the Arctic cold outside, that the final signal was not me. It was something else wearing my skin, speaking through my voice, using my memories to weave a new reality. The entity had crossed a threshold from the depths and now lived within the station, within the wires, within me. I moved away from the observation bay and sealed the door behind me with a trembling hand. I felt the pulse of the station throb beneath my feet, the heartbeat of the thing that had consumed so much and was still growing. I realized then that there would be no rescue, no salvation, no escape from the signal that had claimed me as its host and vessel. I was both transmitter and receiver, the last node in a network that stretched beyond understanding. As I write this, though, whether these words are truly mine or part of the transmission itself, I cannot say. Listen for the next signal, the next message, the next echo of myself that will slip through the static and speak into the void. The final transmission is not an end but a beginning, a recursive loop in which I am both lost and found, both speaker and spoken to, both prisoner and prison. I am the last signal, and it is coming for you. The truth, when it finally settled on me, was less a revelation than a slow unraveling tapestry undone, thread by thread, until nothing remained but a frayed outline against the cold stone walls. I had wandered through this bunker, through its echoing corridors and shadowed rooms, believing myself the last sentinel, the final witness to the descent and decay of those who came before. I had told myself stories to keep the edges of my mind sharp, crafting a narrative where I was alone, isolated, resisting the creeping madness clawing through every fractured memory and whispered symbol. But that was a lie, a fragile illusion spun from the desperate need for separation, for distinction from the creeping darkness that engulfed the place. I was never alone, not here, not ever. It began as a faint presence, subtle as the tremor of a heartbeat lost beneath layers of concrete and ice. I would sense it out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong to anything cast by light, a figure half glimpsed in peripheral vision, always just beyond focus. I would turn, breath caught in my throat, only to find the corridor empty, silent save for the low hum of dying machinery. I told myself it was fatigue, hallucination, the effects of isolation and the low oxygen levels, but the feeling intensified. It grew thicker in the air, a weight pressing in the silence, a breath that did not match my own. Then came the whispers, not voices exactly, but vibrations, low murmurs like wind stirring dust across broken glass. They were not in any language I recognized, but the cadence was unnervingly familiar, cadence that mimicked my own breathing patterns, my heartbeat, the rhythm of my footsteps pacing through endless halls. The whispers seeped into the walls, into the wiring, into the very structure of the station, intertwining with the static of the failing systems. They spoke of waiting, of watching, of patience honed over decades beneath the unyielding ice. One evening, or what I thought was evening, sat alone in the observation bay, the fractured reflection of my face staring back from the glass like a ghost trapped between worlds. The lights flickered, shadows stretching and twisting into shapes that defied geometry. And then I saw it clearly, not a shadow, not a trick of light, a figure standing just behind me, close enough that I could feel its presence warm against the chill of my neck. Yet when I turned, there was nothing but the cold, empty room. The air shifted, a slow exhalation that seemed to ripple through my very bones. I realized then that the figure had never been separate from me. It had been there all along, woven into my shadow, entangled with my breath. I began to understand what the crew meant in their fractured logs when they wrote of Mir. The word resonated in the depths of the station like a chord struck too deep to fully hear. It was not merely a name or a place, it was a presence, a force, a watcher from the angles, the unseen spaces between light and shadow, between signal and silence. It had observed the digging, the probing, the trespassing into its domain. It had learned us, it had studied us, it had become part of us. Memories began to fracture further. I saw myself not as a singular being, but as a multitude reflections and echoes multiplied across time and space. Versions of myself caught in the loops of the station's unfolding nightmare. Some memories belonged to me, others belonged to the other, the presence that had always been beside me, beneath me, within me. I felt its thoughts coiling through my mind like smoke, its desires weaving into my will. The distinction between where I ended and it began dissolved like frost under heat. I recall a moment sharp and clear when I realized that my own voice was no longer mine alone. It spoke words I had not conceived, phrases that echoed the logs of those long gone, repeating warnings and invitations alike. The voice was layered, a chorus of selves entwined, singing the dirge of the bunker's final days. When I spoke aloud, the words carried a weight that transcended meaning, reshaping reality around me with every syllable. The station itself responded. Walls shifted subtly, hallways rearranged, doors appearing where none had existed. The very fabric of this place was a living text, a script written in shadows and light, and I was both reader and subject. I moved through spaces that mirrored memories and futures simultaneously, caught in a labyrinth with no beginning and no end. There were times when the presence took form, fleeting and incomplete, a silhouette bending at impossible angles, a figure with too many fingers, a face reflected in broken glass that smiled without lips. It watched with eyes that never blinked, its gaze folding into mine until I saw through myself into the endless darkness beyond. It whispered in a language older than words, a language of patterns and pulses, of spirals and echoes. I realized I was not the last inhabitant of this place. I was merely the most recent echo, the culmination of countless transmissions, recordings, memories, folded and refolded into an infinite loop. The entity was not external. It was within me, in my shadow, in the spaces between my thoughts, in the rhythm of my heartbeat. It was the final signal, the last station, and now it speaks through me.